correspondent based in the Middle East. That means reporting from Iraq, Gaza, Jerusalem, and before that, Afghanistan and Moscow. Conflict zones. But now the project I'm doing at the moment is more daring because I'm interviewing older women. I used to say I was interviewing old women until one of them said she didn't like that. She was 95 at the time. She's now 99 and still incredibly vital. But we don't hear much from women like her in our society, which worships youth and beauty. Older women disappear from our screens, all of them. When I was a reporter in Moscow, I remember seeing Russian women, old Russian women, standing in the snow to sell trinkets to support their families. A Russian man turned to me and said, "U nas silny babushki," we have strong grandmothers. He was right, but Russia's one of the few places where grandmothers are respected, even feared. The women I've been interviewing for the past 3 years deserve respect. They're Jewish Holocaust survivors. I'm one slide behind. I've gone back to these women who lived through World War II because their numbers are dwindling. The youngest are now in their 80s. And because although they suffered so much, they built something. How did they do that? The theme of this TEDx conference is walls and shadows, and the walls in the lives of these Holocaust survivors are obvious. First, they were herded into ghettos, literal walls, and many then lost their entire families in the Nazi genocide. Some felt shut off by surviving mass murder, an experience that no one else could really comprehend. After all that, they were held in refugee camps, more walls, for years before they could start their lives over. The shadows are the parts of their experiences that they carried with them. And they passed them on, of course, to their children and grandchildren. Anxiety, fear, panic attacks, a feeling of always being an outsider and always needing an escape plan. There's no relaxing, as one of the women said to me. With more people, there are now currently more people on the move than at any time since the end of World War II. And how we treat the traumatised refugees that we take in is a global social issue. What can we learn from these refugees from an earlier era? Here are some of them. It's worth asking this because I've interviewed now more than 30 women from Europe, Russia, and even North Africa. And they live in Australia and in Israel. And I sit in their kitchens and they tell me about their life experience and also their recipes. This has a serious point because many of them had been starving, and that's an experience that affects you for life. Cooking again, having access to a kitchen in which to cook, is a sign that you are rebuilding. Cooking the dishes that you know from home is a comfort and a pleasure, and also a way of retaining identity. For those who didn't even have a single photo of their family, the smell and the taste of this food was memory. They passed that down to their children too. Nancy Kaplan is an American daughter of Holocaust survivors. She cooked a dish and, of course, posted a photo on Facebook. And she wrote, "My mom's brisket. She is not with us since I was in my 20s, but she joins us when we cook and eat her foods." I have a personal motive for doing this because I'm also searching for the taste of memory. For me, that's my grandmother's honey cake. It was dark, fragrant and spicy, a little bit like gingerbread but more moist, and it's the dish that says family to me. My grandmother Leah was young, glamorous and a great cook. When I grew up in Sydney, her kitchen was the heart of our family. It was where we gathered every day after school and where she cooked, which she did without ever using a recipe book really. And then suddenly she died when I was in my 20s. I'd watched her cooking, but I hadn't written anything down. She never wrote anything down. I didn't know how I was going to preserve her memory without those tastes. So my morning became focused on trying to recreate her honey cake. I would, I have to say obsessively, bake and discard one honey cake after another. There was a light French recipe from the great food writer Elizabeth David with clover honey and almonds. There was a heavier Russian cake with 3 types of flour and cottage cheese. They were all delicious, but they weren't right. They weren't my grandmother's honey cake. There is an attempt at any rate. So I'd start baking all over again. What do you learn when you cook with your grandmother? Obviously, you learn a whole lot more than the recipe. You learn family history and your place in the world. You learn that the kitchen is the heart of the home. You learn that special meals are prepared for celebrations, but that you can make an ordinary meal special too, just by caring about how you prepare it. You learn that cooking brings people together. You learn that it can do that even after an argument, that a meal taken together can restore and resolve differences. You learn generosity, warmth, and hospitality. You learn love. That's why I've called my project Food is Love. And I began with Eva Grinston. She's a Holocaust survivor from Slovakia, a fabulous cook, and the mother of one of my closest friends. I watched her caring for her grandchildren, my friend Elizabeth's children. She would cook them nutritious dinners, bake them elaborate birthday cakes, tell them bedtime stories every night. In short, she wrapped them in love. I watched her cooking from a battered old cookbook. It was handwritten, and it was a book with a story, an unforgettable one. In 1940, according to the 1940 census, there were 90,000 Jews living in Slovakia. There were 90,000 Jews living in Slovakia, and by war's end, there were only 30,000. More than 2/3 had been murdered, including members of Eva's family. Soon after the war began, Eva and her mother and her sister Vera were herded into the ghetto in Bratislava, which was then controlled by local allies of the Nazis. In 1944, the Nazis invaded and they began transporting Jews to the death camps in large numbers. Eva's mother hid her daughters, but she was soon caught with Eva's aunt Susan in one location, and then the girls were found where they were hiding. Eva was then 15, her sister Vera was 13. They were loaded onto a train that usually transported animals, and they were taken for 3 days on a journey without food and water. They arrived, they didn't know where. It turned out to be the death camp of Auschwitz. On the platform was an SS officer who separated Eva and Vera. There was no opportunity for goodbye. They didn't even realise it was goodbye, actually. Eva's last image is of Vera's head disappearing into a line on the other side of the platform. There were old women and children in that line, and everyone there was murdered in nearby gas chambers within an hour. Eva was now alone in this most terrible place. She was disinfected, her head was shaved, looking much like that, and she was tattooed with a number that was to replace her name. She too might have been killed, actually, but it was getting close to the end of the war and the Nazis were losing. She was more valuable to them as a slave labourer. 6 months later, she was ill, emaciated, but alive. After a long convalescence, she returned to Bratislava. She had to accept that her mother, her Aunt Susan, and her sister Vera had all been murdered. She went back to her old home and didn't really feel a sense of connection until, in the cellar, she found a box. And in that box was her grandmother's cookbook. That's the book that I saw Eva cooking from in her kitchen. That's the book she's been cooking from ever since, keeping alive the tastes of that vanished world. It's a link to her past, but also, because she cooks for her grandchildren, to her future. So what have I learned interviewing Eva and the other women in this project? Primarily, that's lovely, Eva. Primarily, it's a lesson about resilience, or what psychologists today call post-traumatic growth. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "What doesn't break me makes me stronger." What these women teach is that even if an experience does break you, you can put yourself together, back together, stronger too. Almost every woman I've interviewed gets to a dramatic point in her story, and then she says, "And that was another miracle." And they're right, of course. There had to be luck. They're a tiny remnant. 6 million others did not survive. So I've learnt that sometimes you need a miracle, good fortune, a break in the clouds, to help you scale a wall. Another thing I've noticed is that these women don't complain. At the end of very hard stories, they say to me, "It wasn't so bad. Other people had it worse." Those who can't say that, because they really did have it very badly, they say they survived because of the support of someone else, a mother, sister, brother, or friend. Annette Abel and Stephanie Heller are twins from Prague in Czechoslovakia. Now aged 91, they live in Melbourne, Australia, around the corner from each other. They survived for more than a year in Auschwitz, in the section where inhuman medical experiments were performed. Each says that she survived because of the other. "We were always optimistic," says Annette. "Otherwise we wouldn't be here. Hope brings you further." What other characteristics do these women have in common? First, an obvious point, they're all women. Now, I know the grandmothers usually are, but I've interviewed more than 30 women, and only 3 men. These grandmothers are widows now too. They cope with that loss. Women are the great survivors. Next, they're energetic, full of beans, and also practical. Their feet are firmly on the ground. They are doers, these women, not dreamers. They live a full old age, which includes manicures and trips to the hairdresser. I was standing in the home of Rina Mevorach. She lives in Jerusalem and she's a Holocaust survivor from Libya. I asked if I could upend her kitchen in order to take some photos. And she said to me, that's her in the Jerusalem market, she said to me something I've never forgotten: "You can do whatever you like. There's no one to tell us not to." These women all cook for me, even on my first visit. There's no conversation without coffee and cake. Lots of cake. They always insist on seconds, sometimes even thirds. You try saying no to a Jewish grandmother. It's impossible to be thin on a project like this. They cook from scratch, the way that nutritionists today recommend we all do, but they're adaptable. As their grandchildren become first vegetarian, then vegan, and then gluten-free, out goes meat, sour cream, and white flour, and they are cooking with tofu, cooking the old recipes with tofu and baking GF cakes. None of them waste anything. If your recipe calls for egg yolks, you use the egg whites in another dish. Almost every woman, in fact, I think every single woman that I've seen, when I'm there while she's cooking, she gives leftovers to the local cats. The birds get the crumbs. People who've been hungry don't throw away food. And people who've been hungry, for them their greatest joy is sitting with their families at tables groaning with food that they've prepared. The families that they build and cook for are their triumph over hardship and evil. American poet John Guzlowski is the son of 2 Polish Christians who were held in the Nazi concentration camps. He writes about his father. He hates no one, not God, not the dead who come to him, not the Germans who caught him, not even himself for being alive. He's a man held together with stitches he laced himself. Still, almost all Holocaust survivors were traumatised. Today we'd say they had undiagnosed PTSD as they experienced nightmares, depression, and unexplained rages. Some talked about their experiences. Equal numbers didn't. I've interviewed women who never told their husbands their stories and didn't know what happened to their husbands during the war. But the passage of time did change that. As one woman said to me, after 40 years, we started talking. And when they started talking, it was often to their grandchildren. Many of the volunteers, of the grandchildren who volunteer to take part in the Food is Love project, are actually boys. Now many of them are men, towering over tiny grandmothers. Eva Grinston cooks with her grandson Nicholas and her granddaughter Emily. Both of them say they value the sense of connection that it gives them. When I'm cooking with Eva, it's not just cooking. I'm learning my family story, says Emily. And she says, I have to quote her exactly or I'll be in big trouble. She says that she knows that all the recipes that she's cooked with Eva, that she's learning, she's going to keep on cooking them when it's just her brothers and her, as a way of holding her family together. When we're having our celebrations, I know that it's Eva's recipes that'll be on the table, says Emily Rice. One of the Food is Love grandmothers told me that I was the keeper of their memories. It's a role I like. I'm putting together a book called, of course, Food is Love, with the women's photos, their stories, and of course their recipes, including the new modern updated versions. Everything will be in one place and no one will have to look and search for her grandmother's honey cake. On your chairs you should find a copy of a sample. It's a recipe from Eva Grinston for her delicious sour cherry, chocolate and walnut cake. It comes from her grandmother's cookbook and it's on the table for every birthday for every grandchild in Australia. One last thought for everyone here, and it's this. For all of you who are lucky enough to still have a grandmother, give them a call, drop by, let them cook for you and tell you your family stories. Don't let these women's stories fade into the shadows. They're your stories, our stories too. Thank you.